It's my pleasure for the last session this morning before the discussion to introduce Di Sherlock. Di's poetry residency involved conversations with people affected by cancer and working with cancer at Maggie's West London and Charing Cross Hospital. After one or several conversations, Di wrote a portrait, which she gave back to her sitters. Further editing often followed to add, correct, or remove details. When sitters also felt that their portrait was a good likeness and they liked it, the transaction was complete. However, everyone subsequently agreed to share their portraits in the collection, written portraits, that we have outside there. You're all welcome to a copy if you'd like one, and they're free, as the Wellcome Trust funded this, but you're very welcome to make a donation either to Imperial Health Charity or Maggie's Centres. Written Portraits is available too on our website, where we have some commentary and additional audio, some of which involves people that Di is going to introduce today for us, so that we can hear some of the poems. Thank you, Di.
Just to give you a bit of context, what has become my written portraits practice started off in the memory cafes of Westminster, where I was asked to come in and engage people living with Alzheimer's in conversation and to maybe write something about it. So I didn't really have much of a clue of what I was going to do, but I went in and they were sitting around tables with their relatives and carers. And I opened conversation with a question that I thought would be relevant to them and also might, provoke memory by talking about the garden that I grew up in. And that indeed opened the door and the conversation started. Generally, there were small groups of 4 to 5 people max. And as they talked, I'd had the consent to take notes because I don't record. It's kind of intrusive, but also there are now data issues. And I'd make notes, then I'd go away, and with the voices in my head, I very quickly wrote the stories that I'd heard. And they became, written portraits of those conversations, inspired by those conversations. When I was asked to bring what has now become a practice to Maggie's West and Charing Cross Hospital, I was absolutely terrified. These were a completely different group of people, but also it was a provocation that I could not resist. So over the course of a year, thankfully 2019, because it would not have been possible during COVID, I sat with members of the hospital staff at Charing Cross and people living with cancer at Maggie's West and made 25 portraits, which is what Celia and I decided should be the number, randomly. Actually, it was quite a stretch. And some of the portraits were group portraits, some were individual portraits, but we can go into that later. I think probably what's best now is to hand over to my 3 actors, Lynn, Chris, and Susan, who are going to read 3 of the written portraits that I came up with. The actual process was the same between the memory cafes and working with staff and in cancer care and people living with cancer. But the actual giving back part, the transactional part, was quite different. We'll hear a poem from a volunteer working in Charing Cross Hospital, from 2 men at Maggie's, around the kitchen table at Maggie's, and a member of the staff in cancer care at Charing Cross. So Lynn, if you'd like to start, please.
Yorkshire is God's country. There's no trace of Yorkshire now, except for the echo of a white rose in the immaculate complexion, the quiet loveliness. As a girl, she scoops up the petals in the grandmother's garden outside Hull, adds water for scent. Laughing, she dabs behind her ears, once more in the moment, walking the familiar terrain, the old shed, the bird bath, the fruit trees where she and her brother would hide. It was like having an outdoor house. The family cross the Pennines, and the white rose turns to red. In Manchester in the 60s and 70s, she's sent to convent school. I just rebelled. Now, home is London, where she walks her dog in the local park, a standard schnauzer who thinks she's human. Like all animals, when her owner becomes unwell, she knows. After 3 years working as a volunteer, she is herself diagnosed. The stealth tumour finally shows up in a colonoscopy. There'd been no signs, nothing in the blood. She just felt tired. The time she'd spent working in the hospital helped her cope, she says, prepared her for her own journey. But still, the year the cancer takes brings lostness. After, she wants to be normal again, returns to the tea stand, a subtle and knowing presence where lone souls find succour. Seeing a woman on her own emerge from her consultation, she's prompted to ask, "Do you want a hug?" The woman, who's just got the all clear, doesn't hesitate for a moment. "More than anything, I want a hug." She's always worked on Clinic 8, a non-medical presence who will listen. You build up associations with people. But even after 6 years, it's hard not to be affected. Seeing women in their 20s and 30s, some with newborns, makes her sad. When she's finished, she has to take a deep intake of breath. Beneath the pulse of Clinic 8, loss and lostness are constant. An elegiac strain that underscores the rapid announcements to rooms. She fetches her coat. Abandoned, the tea trolley fades into the wall.
The Three Musketeers. The Three Musketeers, they say. But only 2 are in service round the table. Diagnosed at the same time, they're old sparring partners, since Dave jumped the biopsy queue. "I didn't only say oi," says Ray. "Now I can't get rid of him." He gives Dave an almighty squeeze on the kneecap that prompts a yelp worthy of Beaky, Dave's greyhound, an old racer. "Called Beaky 'cause of his big beak," says Dave, tracing the muzzle in the air. He always tells it like it is. Well, with tattoos and grins piratical, they're like a couple of old-time comedians, always quick off the mark with ready wit and repartee. They weren't always. Ray, it was a bag of nerves when he came in, says Dave. "This place, it lifts you." Ray, snuffling Dave's cake, nods. It's one thing they can agree on. Outside, the Nordic walkers limber up. The leader checks in. Some are sore, some ache. One says, "Oh, she's always under the weather." The naming round the circle falls apart. Never works, the leader laughs. Ray joins them. but Dave's grounded with a broken rib since Beaky pulled him over. The sod! He would have to be the side that I lie on. A cloud of histamine descends from the sweaty London sky, swallows the walkers. Dave remains in the chair that's got his name on it. His granddad was a miner from Matlock, and then the family moved to Shepherd's Bush. All rank QPR supporters now, save one brother, a Spurs fan. Outcast, he snorts. The family took him down since he was 5. On match days, he gets fish and chips on the way, pie and mash with gravy after. Beaky gets his share. He's not a fussy eater, even likes a bit of curry, Chinese as well, but you won't get him on a bus. Goes in a taxi though. It's a luxury breed. He talks of greyhounds past their use-by date, dumped like garbage. The eyes that, like a bit of fun, grow luminous. Behind the banter, the chiaroscuro of the soul. The conversation turns to abseiling. Well, no, several have signed up. Not him. Not since he took a nasty tumble from the top of a ladder he didn't tie off. Dismissing the Spiderman, he talks of music back in the day. Marty Wilde, Joe Brown, and a glint in his eye, Marianne Faithfull. Be very careful, dear, says St. Peter, leaving in. He's trouble. There's a diamond wink from the earring he's worn since he was a rocker. Why, you are what you are, he says with an impish grin, ain't ya? Ray was a mod, suited and booted, wore a parka, not a leather jacket like Dave, who once brought a parka by mistake. Listened to The Who, local to where he grew up in Shepherd's Bush, though there is some debate whether they were mods. Well, what about the Stones? Mods or rockers? The Moody Blues? No question there. He was the youngest of 5. He remembers his mum, the jobs she had to take to keep them when his dad passed at 51. Well, we were poor, but we had good dinners. On a Sunday, the Winkle man had come around with his barrow or his van. They'd go down the road to the neighbours to watch telly. They were good days. But not without their ups and downs. Ray gets in a bit of trouble. His dad has a word, and the boy goes down to Gold Hawk Social and puts on the gloves. For 3 years he trains, loves it, but, wow, was never no good. Not like his brother, who showed promise and could kick a ball too. He tried for QPR and got in. But when their dad passed, a Brentford supporter, he changed his strip. He could have been a contender, Ray muses. But he discovered women. A memento of his old sparring days gleams on a chain round his neck given to him by his son. He's got memorabilia from Nigel Benn, Chris Eubank, also presents from his son, who he doubts knows what else to get him. The ghost of the young pugilist darts across the solid features softened by life and time. The jab, a friendly handshake, yeah? The hook, well, a good-natured jibe. You can take the dog out of the fight, but you can't take the fight out of the dog. He got his diagnosis the day he retired. He went for a test because he happened to be watching telly and saw Bob Monkhouse in a Macmillan ad. Well, like Dave, who went in with a sore throat to find the problem was with the lower works. It's a bolt out of the blue. It was the gym that got him to Maggie's. Wasn't interested to begin with. It's getting on 5 years now. Oh, people who work here are diamond. When he lost his second sister, he took it really bad. He looks at Dave working on his art, it being Friday, reflective. He livened me up. The busy colouring pencil stops. Quickly, he redresses the balance, tells how Dave phoned him up, beside himself when his dog died. He went round and carried the beloved lurcher who died on Dave's bed down the stairs. An act of camaraderie to be expected from an inseparable. The missing musketeer, Andreas, is known for his paella and mean patatas bravas, but he's not eating. He's not all that clever, says Dave. Time passes. Andreas is not mentioned. Or when I ask, fearing the worst, Ray lights up. Oh, he's sounding perky, bright as anything. He hadn't seen him, just talked. Andreas says the food's not bad at all in the care home. Then it's all changed. Andreas wasn't eating after all. He just said so to please his sister. Ray goes to visit, sees him take 3 spoons of soup and wave the dinner away. He's brought Diet Coke, but there's no fridge in the room. So Andreas drinks half, leaves the rest. He won't drink it warm. He hates it there. But they won't move him now. He's dying, says Ray. The words settle on the air. Nowhere to go. In Margravine Cemetery, long fingers of elder bow to the earth, beckon the silence. The third musketeer passes on a full moon in partial eclipse.
Everyday heroines. You get heat, she says. When you ask them, how are you? And they've had bad news. Sometimes they cry in front of you. She's been working in Clinic 8 for 2 years now, taking patients' blood, urine, calling them to the consultant. The stories you hear makes you think, what would I do? She holds me in her strong gaze, warm, generous, rooted in earth. Say simply, you cannot be working and crying every day. You'll cry forever. She's learned resilience in palliative care at St. Charles and, pregnant with her son, caring for her mother when she is diagnosed with cancer. If you are not strong enough inside, you will break down, she says firmly, but still, those who face their mortality with no family around them pierce the vital armour. Sometimes we cry, she says. The blunt truth, the blow I don't see coming. It is her mother who encourages her to do nursing, tells her she has the power to intercede on the patient's behalf, give voice to the voiceless. There's nothing you cannot do, she insists. You can do it, her father echoes. But she wanted to wait till the children were grown and chooses to do health and social care level 5 over 2 years because she has a job and a house to run. She's always finished. It's all to do with management, she smiles. Prepares her children in advance so they prepare themselves. They wash dishes, hoover, but mealtimes are golden. It is important to cook for them. Jollof rice is a favourite. Even her veggie-hating boy can be tricked into munching plant life when it's hidden in the dish. Frying is out, but she understands their palate is different and will change. Once in a while, they can have McDonald's, she grins. Every year she takes them to Paris, where her father, a high-ranking army officer, once made the family home. In his retirement, he's gone back to Ghana, does his best to lure them over. She speaks English, French, and thanks to him, bits of dialects from all over Ghana. I've been places. An Ashanti ancestry shines in the fine bones. The elegant weave sculpting the head is like in a likeness of a goddess. I am in awe. I have a good hairdresser, she laughs. There are a team of 6, with 2 nurses and a manager. One of the team, Marcia, whose picture looms large in the corridor, brought in a banana cake to share with staff and patients. Unwittingly, I met Marcia looking for Florence, who was on lunch break. She asked me my business and, satisfied I had good cause, instructed me to sit and wait. I protested, not wanting to cut short a lunch break. Then I did as I was told. She laughs when I tell her this. Marcia, she says, cannot tolerate nonsense. If you offend her, you deal with it straight away. Patients need to see us working together, she affirms. Free spirits moving around. Nursing is in the blood. She was named after her dad's auntie, a nurse in Ghana, their namesake, an icon of the nursing profession. Her eldest sister is a community nurse. They do not share the status of the lady with the lamp, yet follow her dictate of hard work, their acts of compassion unsung. They are like many others who answer the call, everyday heroines.
Thank you. Thanks to Lynn, Chris, and Susan. So if you'd like to go back to seats for
We now are going to assemble Di. You can stay there. And Flick and Steph on the chairs with Lucy Kimball, who's kindly agreed to discuss these very portraits with the artists now that we've seen and heard a little about them, and to take comments and questions. Do sit down. Comments and questions from us as well.
So I'm really delighted to be here today and share with you the experience we've just had of hearing from these 3 artists and their work in this project. And we're going to talk in a little more depth about their thinking about personalisation and making portraits, and also about what's involved in being artists doing research. Through your practice, what are you trying to do with audiences? So the audience experiences, what are the two qualities of your experience for audiences of your work?
Two qualities. I think that it would probably be two, which is playfulness and friendliness. I guess I work with data, and I try to make a lot of work that communicates data and is our projects that work for all ages, and that try to represent data in a very human or playful or friendly way to hopefully, to reach out to people that might be experiencing it for the first time or might feel intimidated by data or see it as cold and boring. So I guess I want to change their minds.
I just find it really difficult to answer that.
I'll answer and let
Okay.
Flick
Okay.
kind of think. Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd like surprise, because blow open assumptions that you make. People living with cancer, staff working in cancer care, so surprise. And the second is understanding from the heart.
So, the last one is probably the same as what I was going to say, which is about feeling something. Thinking about something through feeling is probably one of the things that I care about. I think that's what I was talking about in a way. I also have a problem with, I used to work with audiences in an institution, and I always had a problem with artists assuming what an audience was and what they might expect an audience to receive. And so I find myself kind of standing back from wanting to presume something about an audience, if you see what I mean.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to start with some questions to you. So you said that the practice of the dialogic portrait started back in 2010. So it was already established practice, and then you did this version of it in the context of this academic project. And I wondered if it so being in the project, did it change how or not how you do that practice?
In a way, it didn't change it, but in other ways it did. So it's the 6th series that I've done, as I mentioned, and each series has been different and has had a different kind of purpose. This one was the first time I've done something that's part of a research project, and I found that challenging and interesting to think about how I was going to work with that. I disappointed myself a lot with it, so I didn't become the academic researcher that I would have liked to have become. And I have this kind of, challenged myself about that all the time. And it did feel like this time I could try to do that. A few years ago I did get a PhD, so I sort of thought this might build on that. As I say, I disappointed myself. I was still working on the project all through the last year during lockdown, and through into this year, in fact. And so that made it a very, very different version of working on dialogic portraits than I had done before. So there were conditions just to do with what we've all been through, or going through, I should say, that made it really quite different and compromised my focus on it in a way.
So when you talked earlier, you talked very clearly about the materiality of the watercolours as a form, and the translations into the film, for example. And also that moment you talked, I think, about the brushstroke as a piece of data, as a data.
I was thinking about that all the time. I never knew whether I could legitimately think about that, but I kind of imaginatively thought about it like that. Yeah.
But if we think about what have you learned about personalisation, which you were already thinking about through the series themselves? So.
I think one of the things I really thought a lot about stability and mobility. And one of the things I forgot to mention actually was about proxies, which is obviously it comes up in the film. I hope you pick that up. But I was thinking about the idea of proxy and how artists are doing that all the time. I don't know whether all artists do it, but it seemed to me that that's kind of one of the things that we do, is work with proxies. But I was also thinking about series. So actually, I cheated in this. So I borrowed pictures that I'd done in other series to stick in the film because I just wanted to. So I was kind of thinking, I was much more conscious about the work as a series, trying to be sort of, that kind of obligation you feel to tell the truth if you're commissioned to do something, which of course you then feel obliged to sort of undermine in some way.
Yeah, thank you. So, turning to you, Di. So, again, your written portraits, as you explained, already existed as a practice before this project. And the way you do that requires and demands participation, different kinds of participation, the agreement of the people to talk to you in the cafes or the Maggies and so on. So the sitting and then the giving back and the commenting and sort of responding to what you've done, and then the participation we've just experienced of the actors reading the poem and our participation as audiences. So there's multiple.
And that's quite a new one, actually. Haven't had that before. That was a new event for me. Yeah.
So have you got new insights into participation through that and personalisation? What does that mean for personalisation?
I don't know what it means for personalisation, but in terms of participation, the difference with this was that the transactional bit, the giving back, took much longer and was much wider and deeper than I'd experienced before. And so really participation, it's like not a one-off event. Like you rock up, they speak, you write a poem, and that's that. It happens in time. And sometimes between having the conversation and writing the poem and getting it to what we call the sitter, and then seeing the sitter again, weeks passed. And in those weeks, people would remember things that they wanted to include. They'd have a slightly different perspective perhaps on things and want stuff tweaked. And their relatives, friends, wanted to have their say as well. So you had participation from people that were not present, that they had their input because they'd give it to their mums, dads, siblings, friends, and then you get feedback from them as well. And sometimes you get feedback from dead relatives in a weird way, because one sitter gave me her father's memoir. And when I read it, it became evident to me that his story was important for hers. So I sort of wove that in as well. So the whole thing about the transactional bit and the participation became much, much wider than I'd experienced before.
Yeah.
And then also, for the first time, I included myself as a participant in some of the poems, which I'd never done before. They were always like, I was not there, or I tried not to be there. But it seemed, not always, but in some cases, it was right to acknowledge the I also as participant.
Yeah. So I want to turn now to this question of likeness and also liking, which is one of the topics of the study.
Yeah.
So I was interested, what happens when you give back the poems to the people,
Yeah.
and then the gap between their understanding of themselves and now you've sort of expanded their family members and so on,
Yeah.
and your understanding. So what happens in that gap?
Well, luckily for me, there wasn't much of a gap. When I gave the poems back, they recognised themselves, and in quite a few cases it was overwhelming. They cried. There were times, and there was a couple of occasions where imagery didn't sit right, and that would be then discussed. I think it was 2 occasions. discussed, and I explained where I came from with a particular image, and they understood that, but they still weren't comfortable. And so in the end, I didn't use it. I talked a bit more with them, and then I used something else, or I came up with something else, and they were happy with that, because, you know, like it's not a writing exercise. The person, the sitter, needs to feel, well, when I was working with the people in the memory cafes, a lady who was 90, when her poem was read back to her, a lady that lived in India before partition. Her name was Sultanat, and she said, what this is an honouring. And it's a mutual honouring. They've honoured me and I've honoured them. And it couldn't be that if someone wasn't comfortable. And that kind of transactional gap, in a way, has to be negotiated and has to be removed.
Thank you. So, Steph, so one way of looking at your work and this sort of other work, the work that you do on your website, is to suggest it's revealing stories and infrastructures and practices around data. So it's, data, or data is the high-level term, but there's all these other things around it which you're revealing and exploring. So to what extent are you interested in data, and how much are you interested in the stuff around the data?
Stuff around it. Originally, I think I was going to say the data, but now up here, I think what I'm interested in is, obviously I visualize data as part of my practice, but I guess I would qualify the stuff around the data as the thing that happens. I think there's value in the act, the physical act of collecting data and of working it out. There's so much more that's happening that isn't seen in the end visualization, which is all neat and tidy and everything's where it needs to be, but all the stuff behind the scenes, all the workings out, all the hand notation, all of the calculations, and the performative act of collecting and gathering data. And so I guess it is the stuff around it in a way that I've never really thought, because I find that in a lot of the work that I make, if I use my personal data, it is that process that is probably more important than the end result. That the bit that gets to the point, which I think with this, well, I suppose that is also the point of a lot of the work that I've made, which is making visible that process. So, the end result, for example, of the airwave study is this repository that researchers can use and study, but there's all this labor that is actually happening. It's really complex, where everything moves through, but maybe you don't see that on the other side.
Yes.
Come back. I was just thinking about things that I particularly picked up on, and there was one thing which is about prediction. And one of the things that happened in relation to COVID particularly was that I had been to various sort of academic events organised by people like you, and I listened to them, and I was encountering some ideas for the first time to do with how data is used and so on, and things like the biobanks and so on, which I hadn't engaged with at all before. And I found it really difficult I could hear it, but I couldn't take it in. And it was only actually when I saw Boris Johnson on television talking as if he was godlike with certainty about data prediction, that I understood where we were and what we were talking about. And for me, that was it was actually the experience of living through basically television and COVID that helped me understand what I was working with.
Yeah, well, I think
the manifestation.
The infographics of the pandemic and the evolving narratives and the political.
So that was so in terms of what I would like my audience to receive, if you like, is a kind of question about certainty, basically.
So I have another question for you, Steph, before I have some more general questions from it. No, that was lovely. So obviously your work is in a variety of formats, media, art, design, commercial context, and then there's academic context and also publications, best-selling publications. So to what extent would you say you have an inquiry, an ongoing inquiry? You did use that term in your introduction, and you did actually say, here are my questions, and have I answered my questions?
So do I have an inquiry? Well, I guess I would say is, so I work in a lot of different ways. I am sometimes an artist in residence, author, artist, designer. I do everything, but so I guess the best way to describe who I am is I can't figure it out. I'm a designer with an art practice. I think I always approach things as a designer. I have a brief that I need as a communication designer. So I guess that's the thing. And that I'm trying to, that kind of overarches everything. But then with what you said about inquiry, I think, well, there's probably two things. First, for this is the first time I've ever done anything like this. I still feel like I'm getting my head around what it means to be part of a research project, and whether I'm doing what I'm supposed to do as an academic. I feel like I don't know what the rules are. I know there's probably someone will say that there aren't any. So, but then I think general inquiry is, I think it comes from a communication perspective where I am just trying to find, I'm interested in things, exploring different ways of informing and communicating, particularly in regards to numbers. I don't know, I just like trying to come up with, it's a design approach where I'm trying to come up with as many new solutions to that problem of representing data, and also convincing people that it doesn't have to be boring, intimidating, or scary. So, I don't know, I think it is really design, like I treat everything like a designer. I have a brief, I have to write myself a brief, and then feel like I have a client, even if it is an audience that doesn't know they're my client. It's all kind of very design focused in how I do it.
Do either of you want to come back onto this point of, like, do you have a set of questions that you're trying to answer through your practice?
No.
I've got something that I definitely feel very pleased about, which is I'm always trying to make my paintings better, basically. That is my question. How can I make a better painting? And actually, recently, since I finished working for you lot, I have made a couple of pictures that I'm quite pleased with. So I'm very grateful to, I'm very grateful for having been part of this project, basically.
Just stepping back from my immediate no. No! I think behind it all is my, I don't know if it's a quest, but inquiry is quite a good word, as to how many different ways to listen. Because listening is on many levels, as we know. And I think I'm still finding out about listening. And the latest thing that I was asked to do was to write, well, not exactly written portraits, but sort of, was to have phone conversations during lockdown. So I never met the person, never saw them, not online, anything. And have a phone conversation with somebody living with an early stage Alzheimer and write something inspired by the conversation. And because it's over the phone, the listening involved a lot of listening to silence and interpretation of silence and different resonances in the voice, and also all kinds of, it was a bit like being in a submarine at times, it was like a sort of sonic reverberations that were going on. It all sounds a bit woo-woo, but it's a very different kind of listening from when you've got someone right in front of you. So I think in that case, that's what I would say I'm still inquiring into.
I want to turn now to the role of artists, different kinds of art or design practitioners in a project like this. So one way of thinking about people like you, by engaging the three of you in different ways in the project, is it's social scientists, cultural theorists, trying to listen to artists and art practice, observe, listen, study. You know, there's a whole room full of people interested in these art practices and what they're doing within the wider project. And I wondered if you had some reflections on, even if it was your first time doing something like this with academics or on those different kinds of academic research in the project. You had some reflections on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing that, for example, for me, you know, talking to Helen and Ross about, you know, I'm conducting interviews and I'm looking at something, but because what I'm doing isn't like, I mean, I know I don't want to like talk myself down. It's research, but it's not like proper research. So I can actually kind of, I'm kind of outside the bounds of having to write up like a proper ethical, get all of that approval. Not that I'm doing anything that's wrong, but it means I can, you know what I mean? You can just kind of nibble around in spaces that otherwise you'd have to be very rigid and sure that you know, it's just a different sort of framework.
Yeah, I feel like your pink outlier line.
Yeah.
I mean, as soon as I saw that, I thought, yeah, I relate to the pink outlier line.
So yeah, like, you know, you're moving around a space in a way that is not necessarily, you know, there's like a certain journey through if you're doing it in a formal research setting. Then the artist gets to veer in and out and kind of trip over things. And then I think that through that perspective, like, I guess in the way that you describe things that isn't necessarily what is the common terminology or language that is used in research, I feel like then hopefully would, I don't know, offer conversation points. It's kind of like, I don't know, just thinking about it now, like if somebody is not a native speaker of your language, and then they describe something in a way that is incredibly poetic, but then they say, oh, I'm saying it wrong. But you're like, no, it's really wonderful because you've helped me see a part of my language in a way that I never would have looked at it. And actually your way that's idiosyncratic is actually better and more wonderful. So I guess maybe it's like that.
I did, in 1984-85, I did a residency at Durham Cathedral. And while I was there, it was completely isolated. But it was very, very difficult. But one of the things that I really enjoyed about it was because there was no real art scene in Durham, but there was a very strong university scene, I was able to mix with people from different disciplines, and in a way that was kind of, I was constructing it myself, basically, this mixture, and it was, for me, really interesting. I used to also catch trains in the 90s between Lewes and London at sort of 8 o'clock in the morning sometimes, and I would find the same thing, all these people from very different types of work all talking together about what they were doing. I found it completely fascinating. So for me, this project has given me that, but with kind of much more coherence in a way that's been much more sort of, well, it's really satisfying from that perspective. I've always found the kind of discipline approach to things problematic, basically. So from that point of view, I was really grateful for, I mean, actually, I can't say I was grateful to Boris Johnson, but I was sort of glad that I had been, as it were, primed to hear that kind of manifestation of stuff, because then I could get it. And I've done, although I certainly haven't done the academic research, I have really tuned in to what's happening in terms of the use of data. I've understood it in a way that I just hadn't quite, it was too abstract for me before. And so that, I think, that kind of cross-disciplinarity has been incredibly fruitful for me, actually. And the disappointing thing has been that because of, well, the structure of the project maybe, but I would say more to do with COVID, was that we were having these, for me, really useful, what were they called? Reading meetings or something. I can't remember what we called them. But anyway, sort of research type meetings every so often where we were discussing what we were all doing, which had to stop. And in a way they came to an end, but it meant that, for instance, when you came on board, Steph, we weren't having those conversations. Yeah. And one of the things that I've really felt this morning was seeing the work together. I kind of had a feeling that it was going to do this, and it absolutely did it for me, which was to say, oh, wow, actually, these three different sort of channels through us working alongside one another has actually been incredibly productive, and they talk to each other in a way that I found very, very much more kind of, as it were, fortunate or curated, I don't know which, or both, than I had anticipated.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, Flip. Yeah, I just looking at your data flows and and the way that you were visualizing stuff, and then your timeline, Flip, I've really got a sense of confluence. Yeah.
Has your work been autonomous in this project? Has that been important, or have you adapted?
What do you mean by autonomous?
I'm not sure.
In the sense that not interfered with?
I mean, knowing the co-investigators, but I don't think they've been interfering, but it's more that it's a context. So you have been funded by and responded to the context.
Yeah, but not consciously. I think I was, I feel very grateful to particularly Celia and Sophie for bringing me in on this, because I suddenly thought, well, I don't know how to respond actually, other than to do what I do. So it wasn't a conscious, oh my God, every time I go into Maggie's, I've got to think about personalisation. It was not until I came to work on the website, particularly with Sophie, that I was forced to think in an academic way, which is not my natural wont. And it was good for me, because I discovered things about the work that hadn't been clear to me before, or weren't there actually in my brain. But it didn't interfere with the practice of sitting with people and listening to people and writing. I mean, thank God they never edited my poems. I edited them myself. But when we came to write what we call the blurb on the website, then I kind of deferred to those that knew best in terms of how to reconfigure whatever we'd come up with, or whatever I'd come up with to fit the certain boxes.
Do either of you have comments on the question of autonomy?
Yeah. I did, hold on. I'll answer last. I didn't have a comment. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, I just want, because actually I found it really interesting, because of course I said I wanted to do better paintings, but actually I also wanted to make a better film. For me, the working on the film gave me a chance, it gave me funding to do the film, so on and so forth, in a way that, I'd made films before, but it was going up a notch. And the interesting thing about that is when you're when I'm making paintings, I'm on my own making my decisions. But when I'm making a film, the convention is with making films is that you show them as drafts to all sorts of people and get feedbacks before you make the final thing. And so I showed them the film to Celia, who also shared it with Sophie, I think. And so got feedback from them, because I offered them two different versions, not as the final, but two different drafts, a short and a long. And they preferred the long, so I made it in between.
An autonomous decision there.
So ultimately it was my decision, but also I worked a lot with, I would say, in much more depth with Celia in terms of preparing something, some pages for the website, and also for a short text for an interview for that's going into a book. So there was a lot of work at that stage around, as it were, thinking through the series of the paintings. Really, I would say.
Okay, yeah, now I've got it. I was just going to say that I don't think maybe I don't really know. Like I said, I always have a design mindset, so I am always working to a brief, and I'm always working for a client, even if they don't think that they're the client. Even if they think that they're giving me this autonomous space, I'm fretting away about what people will think. But that, I think, is because I come from a commercial background where, I have to change everything according to feedback. So the thing that I'm still, there has been a lot of freedom in this, and I think because I work in all these different spaces, I'm still coming to terms with what that means to do what I want and what that will look like. And it feels a little bit strange to me. Like in the beginning, it was very structured because I was doing all the research, but then later on I had to make the work, and having that openness to do whatever I wanted. I don't know, I'm not really used to it. I find it a little bit scary. So I don't know. I know you're...
I just want to ask a particular follow-up question around the work, because obviously both Flick and Di have talked about how their sitters have an opportunity to review the portrait, whereas has that happened with your views of
briefly, right at just in the last week. I went through, because, I don't know, you know how on projects you have like that dark time where you don't want to show it to anyone? I was wrestling with that for a few months, and then it always comes together as it does when you finally take a step back and you're like, this is okay. But like a week before, you were like, it's going to take months to finish. So that just happened very recently for me. But I think I received some nice feedback from the database manager, and from a few people saying that they found it was interesting that I was able to create such like beautiful, complex visual things from what, as one described, a very mundane, dry process or something very technical. So, which I think has been really interesting. It must be very strange to have like a artist in residence quietly working away on your day-to-day job. Yeah, I guess maybe then I feel like I did what I wanted to do. What I am always interested in is finding things that are boring and showing people that they're not. They're not boring. You know what I mean. Everyone knows what I mean. The things that seen on first instance might, like that there is something there for everyone, that there's something really wonderful that a really big audience should actually look at. And that's, I think, hopefully I've captured.
Yeah, so the audience is much bigger than
just the people within it.
The database manager. So before I just open up to the floor, I just got one further quick question to each of you. So what would a world look like in which artists were routinely involved in academic research projects? What would be liberating and what would be lost? With appropriate funding, obviously. Generous funding. Who'd like to go first? Flick?
Okay. I think generationally artists are quite different, and I think if you were trained in my era, it would have only been a certain number of artists who might have worked well in cross-disciplinary groups in this way. And I think younger artists are much more adaptable and much more much better at listening, much less egocentric quite often, which is great. Not always the case, but let's work with that. And so I think that actually I think you have to have the right attitude as an artist to make it work well, but you also need to have the right attitudes of the research, the principal investigators, and other researchers working on it for it to work well. And I have to say, I don't think I could have had a better experience than the one I've had. And one of the things I didn't mention was that Celia was the person I was working most closely with on a regular basis. And one of the aspects of, I don't know whether everybody feels like this as an artist, but I certainly have a serious problem of sort of self, abasement, the kind of the dark period bit, and all that. And actually having the experience of having Celia act sort of like a supervisor, like I would go and occasionally have a conversation with her, and I'd just be able to say a load of rubbish actually, and she would withstand it, and we would continue, and be very helpful. And I think that support for artists is a different kind of support than the funding. And I think those continuities and the kind of potential for decategorization that this crossover, for me, that's a really big thing that, I want the world to love each other, basically, and I want us all to love each other and peace and love. And I think that working together across disciplines and decategorizing is a good way of doing it, but within a form where we feel like we can actually work durationally with each other and in depth, rather than the superficial kind of peace and love marketing version of events. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I'm kind of a bit awestruck there, Nick. Yeah. I don't know if I have anything significant to add to that, other than to, just said it would be a retelling of the story, the human story, by artists is always worthwhile in my book, and would be a good balancing with data, science, or whatever else. I echo the support thing. I had Sophie, who I always referred to as my handler. So that if I was going completely AWOL and off-piste, I would be gently nudged into certainly not submission, but into into conversation.
So we had a supervisor, a handler, and what was your relationship?
Oh gosh, I said, I'm a designer, so probably clients.
That's interesting. That's just very interesting.
So, where I'm like, I really, really hope they like it.
So just to pick up that question, in a future world where these things are routine, what would it look like, and what might be lost?
I'm not quite sure about what might be lost, but obviously I will just add to the support thing. I think the thing that I have found really useful about this is just academic discourse of thinking about a topic, which someone who doesn't, like, just in the meeting, I don't know, it's just a different way of, I'm just not used to it. I'm used to, like, direct feedback, whereas here it's all, so, at least, like, within the group, nobody seemed like, nobody's trying to, like, slam everyone down like they are in the commercial world, but instead it's just, like, have you thought about this, have you thought about that, or that's just, like, pushing things forward for the sake of it, as opposed to reaching, like, a commercial endpoint. I don't know, I found that really valuable. I don't think that really answered your question. I'll just agree with everything else.
Okay, so I'd like to invite questions from the audience. I don't know if we're using a mic. We are using a mic. Has anyone got a question for any of our speakers, or all of them together? I've got more, if not. Oh.
Thanks all of you for this morning's presentations. It was so great to hear the diversity of approaches. I had a question, maybe thinking or asking you each at what point the whole project pushed against or expanded or made your usual medium wobble, if at all. So, you know, the edges of it, the edges of the practice, and whether you experience that in terms of how you usually work, like the watercolor, where did it start to fail, and then you were like, actually this should move to sculpture. I don't know, I'm just thinking that you all have a media, or maybe the writing of the portraits, you started thinking there should be a song. That's what I mean.
I started thinking there should be an end. Because sometimes the meetings with the sitter evolved over weeks and weeks. And when I was in Maggie's Around the Kitchen Table, which sadly is no more because of COVID, it was quite a challenge to keep what I'd got intact as you met the people again, and then ooh, and. Yeah. So it's kind of like boundaries, I think, for me. So it's so otherwise they become. There was a risk of it becoming like super epic and unraveling, and that would be the wobble bit. It's like, whoa! I've just actually got to say no. That's done now, in the can.
I think I had a wobble because of the material, or like the technique that I was using. So, you know, I think a lot of this, obviously, we're in a pandemic, and so I've been working at home. I alternate kitchen table and the home office with my husband, and so I knew I wanted to make, like, I was doing a lot of sketching on A4 paper, like in that. But that I wanted to make bigger work. So instead of using pencil, like what I'm used to, I did make everything with pencil, but I was doing it on the iPad. And so that was like a really big learning curve, just worrying about how to make a pencil line on an iPad and not feel too much like it's on an iPad. But it is just the way that I work as well, which is like everything that you see out there is created in Photoshop, where I draw and I redraw sections, and then I seam them all together like a big mosaic in Photoshop. But I'm halfway through that thinking, is this even going to work? Because I feel like, dealing with electronic pencil and everything felt so different to how I was exploring it originally with my small kind of starting sketches, that I was really worried about like what that end result would look like. So just totally like different materials. But I mean, it's great because it's forced me to try something different. But that's probably why I had that dark time for a while.
It was the dots.
All those dots, yeah, which are like a mix of done by hand and scanned, and then also like carefully positioned in Photoshop. So it's just. But there was like constant working and reworking, but doing that in a variety of different ways, whether it's on screen or on A4 sheets of paper that had to be scanned on an A4 scanner because that's all I had space for. So yeah, I was really bound by kind of a small footprint for the whole thing.
I had two big wobbles. One was a literal one because I was remember, was it last year? We had a lockdown at the beginning. Was it this year or last? No, it was last year. A lockdown at the beginning and then a lockdown in the autumn. And in the summer, I was walking down the pavement and someone ran over me. And so I had a broken leg. So I was locked down again. So it was a perpetual lockdown. And it really, really affected my work. Because by that time, I was meant to be starting. The film, at the beginning of the film, there's a bit where people are sitting around the table. So that, I was meant to be doing that then. And loads and loads of things went wrong all the way through making the film initially because of my broken leg, and then because of lockdown. So I went straight into lockdown. And I was very keen to film in the summer because I wanted it to be bright and sunny. And and you'll notice that most of the film is done in November. So that was a literal wobble. There was another wobble which was around who was going to sit for me. And I think I got it wrong. I think that we had some quite complicated discussions early on, well, quite early on, before I started, about who that group would be, and we shifted it, and I think, and then one of the things that I thought was that I would invite people from the research group to be part of, to sit for me, as well as lots of other people. And I think I was wrong. I thought I'll invite them towards the end because I want to just find my own way a bit before I start inviting them. But actually, because I invited them towards the end, for various reasons, they couldn't, some of them couldn't come, and we couldn't complete that aspect of it, I don't think. As well as, and I think what that meant was when I was making the film, I actually didn't have as much sort of deep knowledge from the sitters as I wanted to have a mix of experience and knowledge, and I didn't feel I'd got quite as much of the kind of more academic knowledge than as I wanted.
Any other questions? We've got time for one more, probably.
The quality of silence here is absence of question.
I have one, but go ahead, please.
I was just sort of thinking about openness and thinking. Hi. Yeah, I was thinking about openness and willingness to share from the point of view of your sitters, and I just wondered if you came across instances where you had trouble with that and where you were quite closed down. And just if you could comment on that.
Well, I can. In the introduction to Written Portraits, I say that it felt, not with the hospital staff, which were super organised, and I had I had 30 minutes max to sit with that person and in that office and whoosh, finish, that was it. But with Maggie's, the setup was much, one could say freer or looser, but for me it was difficult because I felt like a cold caller. And I was invited to sit around the kitchen table. Well, you don't just sit around that kitchen table if you feel you are either a fraud because you're not living with cancer, or it hasn't been enough or extensively publicised for people to understand why you're there. And continually asking permission to join the table or explaining what you're up to. So there was a sort of poster put in the front, but that kind of disappeared really quickly. And because people came and went around that table, and I was there for like over a year, they kind of got to know me and I got to know them. And so the self-introduction didn't happen anymore, except the one time it didn't happen is when we had an issue, or rather I had an issue with one of the guys around the table who said, "Who are you? What are you doing?" in a very challenging way. And I apologised for not having introduced myself. And this was way down the line after I'd been there for about 5-6 months. And explained, personally and all of that. And that was but he accepted that, he was fine with that, and he actually said, can I have a written portrait? Fine. But he wanted it fed back to, the staff, that there needed to be, this notice needed to be up there the whole time. Absolutely right. And that for me was, I mean, it's not traumatic, but it was definitely an unpleasant situation. And I think, as an artist, the last thing you want is to have to justify your presence. Whether it's getting funding or being invited onto a board or sitting around a table with people, all of whom know what you're up to except for one, right? And it creates a tension that you don't want, or an energy that you don't want. So we got over that, and it was fine. And then subsequently, he came quite regularly after that. He'd been ill, so that's why I hadn't met him before. And we became like quite jocular and all the rest of it. But it was something that really was flagged up to me, that what I didn't want to have to do was continually introduce myself to people that knew who I were anyway. But by assuming that everybody knew what I was up to, I made a mistake.
Any additional responses?
If you want, I can. Okay. One of the things that I tried to do new for this series was to make portraits of more than one person at a time. I didn't do an awful lot like that, but it was really complicated, and particularly if I didn't know the people. So, for instance, I had two people who came and sat for me together, and I wanted them very much for all sorts of reasons, and I thought they would fit in to the series well. But actually, one of the things that I realised, I'm not sure when I realised it, but I now think, was that the dynamic that they brought with them, between them, and they're a couple, was something that I hadn't anticipated how that would be, and the kind of, people talk about triangulation. I never really know what it means, but I think it might, if it means something to do with 360 degrees and stuff, and making something more like cuboid rather than flat, that's what happened. And I ended up, I think they're the only people who I didn't put their work in the film because I didn't think it was good enough. I didn't want to put it in. And I also felt that things had been not quite resolved I hadn't felt that it was comfortable enough, let's say. And there were other situations that were similar, and particularly one of the things that happened was a number of people just didn't get back to me when I was doing the follow-up recorded discussion with them. And it was, I could speculate why not, but I don't think it was bad feeling. I think it was all sorts of other things going on. So there was a kind of the way I work, I think there's a kind of informality about it, which works, but sometimes doesn't work.
Okay. So I think we need to allow you to all have some lunch because there's a really interesting afternoon ahead. So I think we've covered a lot of ground about these amazing practices and the sort of the nature of that intersection of those ways of working into this kind of project and the participation and the ethics and so on. So please remember the work is outside for you to engage with over lunch and
grab a book
and contribute donations as well afterwards. And please join me in thanking these three amazing artists, Flick, Di and Steph.